November 24, 1944, 06:30 hours. Saipan Airfield, Mariana Islands. The engines of 110 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses roar to life across the coral runway, their four Wright Cyclone radials breathing fire into the pre-dawn darkness. The sound is not mechanical. It is primordial, the rumble of thunder contained in aluminum and steel. Major Robert K. Morgan, once commander of the legendary Memphis Belle, adjusts his oxygen mask and checks his instruments for the 13th time. Beside him in the pilot's seat of dauntless Dottie sits Brigadier General Emmett Rosie O'Donnell, Jr., commander of the 73rd Bombardment Wing. They are about to attempt something unprecedented in warfare: a daylight precision bombing raid on the heart of Imperial Japan from an altitude higher than Mount Everest. The thin Pacific air carries the scent of aviation fuel and coral dust as one by one the silver giants lumber down the runway, their bomb bays heavy with 500-pound general-purpose bombs and incendiaries. Each aircraft carries 11 men sealed within a pressurized cabin. 11 Americans about to demonstrate that the vast Pacific Ocean could no longer protect Japan from the industrial might of a nation that had mobilized every factory, every worker, every resource for total war. As the bombers climb into the breaking dawn, their contrails form white scars across the tropical sky, pointing like an arrow toward the rising sun. This was to be the first direct assault on Tokyo since Jimmy Doolittle's audacious carrier raid 30 months earlier. But where Doolittle's 16 B-25s had struck like lightning and vanished, these superfortresses would arrive in broad daylight at an altitude where the air was so thin that men required constant oxygen to remain conscious, where the cold was so severe that exposed skin would freeze in minutes, where the very act of breathing became a conscious effort against the crushing indifference of the stratosphere. The target: the Nakajima Aircraft Engine Factory at Musashino, 10 miles west of Tokyo, the beating heart of Japan's aviation industry, where the engines that powered Zero fighters and Betty bombers were forged from steel and fire. For the men aboard those climbing B-29s, this mission represented more than strategic bombing. It was proof that American industrial capacity, American engineering, and American resolve could reach across 6,000 miles of ocean to touch the enemy's homeland with the same mechanical precision that had transformed Detroit automobile plants into the arsenal of democracy. Yet as the bombers climbed toward their cruising altitude of 30,000 feet, none could foresee that they were about to participate in a collision between two military philosophies: American faith in technological superiority against Japanese belief in spiritual determination. In the thin air above Japan, altitude would reveal itself as America's most devastating weapon, more decisive than any bomb, more crushing than any artillery barrage. For in that rarefied atmosphere where eagles could not fly, the mathematical reality of physics would prove more absolute than courage, more final than sacrifice. The Japanese pilots waiting to defend their homeland had trained for this moment with the intensity of samurai preparing for their final battle. Squadron leader Yasuhiko Kuroe of the 47th Sentai had briefed his men throughout the night, studying intelligence reports of these new American bombers. The B-29s, they were told, were larger than any aircraft Japan had ever produced, capable of carrying enormous bomb loads across unprecedented distances. But they were still aircraft, still vulnerable to bullets and cannon shells, still operated by men who could bleed and die. What the Japanese commanders did not fully comprehend was that the B-29 had been designed from its first blueprint to exploit the one resource America possessed in unlimited abundance: space, vertical space. The superfortress was engineered to cruise at altitudes where the air pressure was less than a quarter of that at sea level, where the temperature plunged to 50 degrees below zero, where human beings could survive only within the cocoon of pressurized cabins and heated flight suits. The Boeing engineers who created this aircraft had not merely built a bomber, they had constructed a high-altitude fortress that transformed the sky itself into an American strategic advantage. The Japanese air defense system, by contrast, had been designed around different assumptions. Their fighters, the nimble Zero, the robust Ki-61 Tony, even the newer Ki-84 Hayate, had been optimized for speed, maneuverability, and fuel efficiency in combat zones where altitude was measured in thousands, not tens of thousands, of feet. These aircraft, products of a resource-constrained industrial base, reflected Japanese military philosophy: rely on superior training, tactical innovation, and spiritual determination to overcome material disadvantages. As the B-29 formation crossed the Japanese coastline at 09:30 hours, climbing steadily toward 30,000 feet, the mathematical reality of high-altitude warfare began to assert itself with the cold precision of physics. The Japanese pilots scrambling to intercept them faced a problem that no amount of courage could solve. Their aircraft simply could not perform at the altitude where the Americans chose to fight. At 30,000 feet, the air contains barely 30% of the oxygen available at sea level. Aircraft engines, like human lungs, starve for breath. Propellers bite into air so thin that their efficiency plummets. Control surfaces become sluggish as the compressed air needed for aerodynamic response grows scarce. For the Japanese fighters clawing their way upward, each 1,000 feet of altitude came at the cost of speed, climb rate, and maneuverability. They were not climbing toward combat. They were ascending toward their own operational limits. Flight Lieutenant Takeshi Doi of the 244th Sentai, flying a Ki-44 Shoki, later recalled the desperation of that interception attempt. We climbed with our engines screaming at maximum power, watching our fuel gauges drop as rapidly as our airspeed indicators. The Americans were visible as silver specks against the blue, impossibly high, impossibly distant. By the time we reached 28,000 feet, our fighters were wallowing like ships in heavy seas. The controls felt dead in our hands. The American crews, sealed within their pressurized cabins, experienced none of this struggle. They breathed normally, communicated clearly over their intercom systems, and maintained formation integrity with the casual precision of men operating well within their equipment's design parameters. The B-29's pressurization system, revolutionary for its time, created an artificial environment that allowed human beings to function efficiently at altitudes that would incapacitate unprotected personnel within minutes. Sergeant Tom Harrison, tail gunner aboard Sweet Sioux in the 498th Bombardment Group, observed the Japanese interception attempts with something approaching sympathy. We could see them down there, maybe 5,000 feet below us, trying to climb up to our altitude. They looked like they were swimming uphill through molasses. Their engines were pouring black smoke from the strain, and you could tell they were giving everything they had just to stay airborne at that height. The Japanese pilots who did manage to reach interception altitude discovered that their ordeal had only begun. At 30,000 feet, human physiology becomes humanity's enemy. Without pressurized cabins, the pilots breathed pure oxygen through masks that froze to their faces in the sub-zero temperatures. Their exhaled breath formed ice crystals inside their cockpits. Their instruments fogged over. Most critically, the extreme altitude affected their cognitive function, slowing reaction times and impairing judgment at the precise moment when split-second decisions meant the difference between successful attack and fatal collision. Captain Saburo Sakai, the legendary Japanese ace, attempted an interception in his Zero and later described the experience. At that altitude, it was like trying to fight while drowning. Every breath was an effort. My hands were numb despite heated gloves. The thin air made every movement of the aircraft feel wrong, sluggish, unresponsive. And there above us, those silver bombers flew as steady as trains on rails, untouchable in their realm of thin air and bitter cold. The Americans had not merely gained altitude, they had claimed an entire dimension of warfare as their exclusive domain. The B-29's service ceiling of 31,150 feet placed it beyond the effective reach of most Japanese interceptors. The few Japanese aircraft capable of reaching such altitudes, the Ki-44 Shoki, the Ki-61 Tony, and the newer Ki-84 Hayate, could barely function at their operational limits, while the superfortresses cruised comfortably within their design parameters. This technological disparity reflected a fundamental difference in industrial philosophy. American aircraft designers, working with abundant resources and advanced manufacturing capabilities, had created systems with enormous operational margins. The B-29's four Wright R-3350 engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, were designed to operate efficiently across a wide range of altitudes and conditions. The aircraft's pressurization system, remote-controlled gun turrets, and sophisticated navigation equipment all testified to an industrial base capable of solving complex engineering problems through the application of advanced technology and abundant materials. Japanese aircraft, by contrast, represented the philosophy of elegant minimalism forced by resource constraints. The Zero's legendary range and maneuverability came at the cost of armor protection and high-altitude performance. The newer Ki-84, Japan's most advanced fighter, could theoretically reach the B-29's altitude, but only by operating at the very edge of its performance envelope, sacrificing fuel capacity, armament effectiveness, and pilot safety. As the B-29 formation approached its target, the Nakajima Aircraft Engine Factory at Musashino, the Japanese mounted their most desperate interception attempt. Every available fighter of the 10th Air Division scrambled to engage the American bombers. Ki-84 Hayats dove from above in near-vertical attacks. Ki-61 Tonys attempted coordinated frontal assaults. Ki-44 Shokis climbed to their maximum ceiling and fired their 40mm cannons in hopeful desperation. The air battle that ensued was less a combat engagement than a demonstration of technological determinism. The Japanese pilots, operating at the limits of human and mechanical endurance, could manage only brief, poorly coordinated attacks before their fuel situation forced them to break off engagement. Their cannon shells, fired from aircraft wallowing at the edge of stall speed, scattered harmlessly around the bomber formation. Their machine gun bursts, aimed by pilots struggling with oxygen deprivation and frozen controls, peppered empty sky. The B-29 crews, comfortable within their pressurized environment, returned defensive fire with the mechanical precision of men operating advanced weapon systems under optimal conditions. The superfortress's remote-controlled gun turrets, equipped with computing gun sights, tracked attacking fighters with electronic precision. The 50-caliber machine guns, fed by abundant ammunition supplies, maintained sustained fire that filled the thin air with lethal intersecting streams of bullets. Yet for all the fury of the combat, the true devastation was not kinetic but psychological. The Japanese pilots, many of them veterans of countless Pacific battles, realized with growing horror that they were no longer fighting other aviators. They were struggling against an entire industrial system that had rendered their skills, their courage, and their sacrifice irrelevant. The Americans had not defeated them through superior piloting or tactical innovation. They had simply engineered them out of the battle by claiming an altitude where Japanese aircraft could not effectively operate. Flight Lieutenant Hiroshi Nishida, flying a Ki-84 that day, later reflected on the crushing realization. We were like samurai attacking a fortress with swords, while the enemy dropped stones from walls too high for us to scale. All our training, all our experience in aerial combat, meant nothing when we could barely keep our aircraft flying straight at that altitude. We were not fighting other pilots. We were fighting the sky itself, and the Americans had made the sky their ally. The bombing run itself proved anticlimactic. High winds at altitude scattered the bombs across the target area. cloud cover obscured the aim points. Only 24 bombers actually attacked the primary target, dropping 240 bombs that caused minimal damage to the reinforced concrete structures below. But the strategic impact transcended the physical destruction. Japan's military leadership, watching helplessly as American bombers struck the heart of their homeland with impunity, understood that they faced an enemy capable of projecting power across previously unimaginable distances with technology that made conventional defense impossible. The return flight emphasized the disparity even more starkly. While Japanese fighters limped back to their bases with near-empty fuel tanks and frost-damaged engines, the B-29s cruised homeward with sufficient fuel reserves for navigation errors and mechanical contingencies. The Americans had designed their aircraft not merely to reach Japan, but to do so with the operational margin necessary for sustained strategic bombardment. They had created a weapons system capable of treating the vast Pacific Ocean as merely an extended runway. Only one B-29 fell to enemy action that day, rammed by a damaged Ki-44, whose pilot, realizing his fighter could not return to base, chose to take an American bomber with him in death. The ramming was less a tactical success than a gesture of desperation, the aerial equivalent of throwing one's sword at an unreachable enemy. It symbolized the Japanese realization that conventional aerial combat had become impossible against opponents who fought from an altitude where physics itself served as their shield. The symbolic object that would come to represent this new reality was not a weapon or a piece of equipment, but something as simple as an oxygen mask. In the B-29s, American crews breathed normally through their aircraft's pressurization system, occasionally donning oxygen masks only as a precautionary backup. The masks represented redundancy, safety margins, the luxury of multiple backup systems in case of primary system failure. They were symbols of industrial abundance, of an engineering philosophy that solved problems by providing more capability than theoretically necessary. For Japanese pilots, oxygen masks became symbols of desperation. Handheld oxygen bottles, crude breathing apparatus, improvised life support systems that allowed them to survive at altitudes that pushed both man and machine beyond their design limits. The masks froze to their faces. The oxygen bottles provided only minutes of breathable air. The equipment represented not technological sophistication, but the harsh compromise of trying to fight a war with inadequate tools against an enemy whose industrial capacity seemed limitless. Staff Sergeant Mike Romano, radio operator aboard City of Los Angeles, watched a Japanese fighter pilot's desperate interception attempt and later wrote to his family, "You could see him up there, maybe 1,000 feet below us, trying to climb higher. His engine was smoking, his plane was shaking, and you knew he was giving everything he had just to stay in the air. When he finally got close enough to fire, his bullets fell short. Not because he was a bad pilot, but because his plane just couldn't perform at that altitude. It wasn't a fair fight. It was like watching a man try to throw rocks at an airplane." The raid's aftermath revealed the broader implications of altitude advantage. Japanese aircraft manufacturers, studying the interception attempts, realized that their entire approach to fighter design had been rendered obsolete. They began desperate efforts to develop high-altitude interceptors, turbocharged engines, pressure suits for pilots, rocket-powered aircraft that could briefly reach extreme altitudes. But these were reactions to American technological innovation, attempts to solve problems that American engineers had anticipated and prepared for years earlier. The Americans, meanwhile, analyzed the mission's results with the systematic thoroughness of an industrial process. They identified mechanical failures, calculated fuel consumption rates, assessed bombing accuracy, and planned improvements for subsequent raids. The B-29 program represented not just aircraft production, but the application of industrial methodology to warfare itself. Each mission generated data that improved the next mission's effectiveness, creating a feedback loop of technological refinement that Japanese industry, operating under severe resource constraints, could not match. General Curtis LeMay, who would soon assume command of the bombing campaign, understood the strategic implications immediately. The altitude advantage had transformed strategic bombing from a costly exchange of losses into a virtually unopposed industrial process. The Americans could schedule bombing raids with the same predictability as factory production runs, knowing that Japanese defenses could not effectively challenge aircraft operating at extreme altitude. The psychological impact on Japanese military leadership was profound. They had built their Pacific strategy around the assumption that distance would protect the homeland from direct attack. The B-29 raids shattered that assumption, demonstrating that American industrial capacity could project sustained military power across any distance. More devastating than the physical destruction was the realization that Japan faced an enemy whose technological capabilities were advancing faster than Japanese. Countermeasures could be developed. Emperor Hirohito, receiving reports of the raid, reportedly expressed concern not about the immediate damage, but about the implications of uncontested American access to Japanese airspace. The emperor understood that a nation incapable of defending its own sky had lost the fundamental prerequisite for military victory. The Americans had demonstrated that they could strike Japan at will, whenever they chose, with whatever force they deemed appropriate. The transformation of perception was complete. Japanese pilots, who had entered the war confident in their aircraft's capabilities and their own superior training, now faced the demoralizing reality that technology had made their skills irrelevant. American pilots, initially awed by Japanese aviation prowess, demonstrated at Pearl Harbor and in early Pacific battles, now operated with the confidence of men possessing absolute technical superiority. Bomber crews began referring to their high-altitude missions as milk runs, reflecting their growing confidence that Japanese interceptors posed minimal threat. This casual dismissal of enemy capabilities represented more than tactical assessment. It reflected the psychological dominance that comes with technological supremacy. The Americans had not merely gained altitude, they had claimed the moral authority that comes with the ability to project power without fear of effective retaliation. The oxygen mask, that simple piece of survival equipment, became the perfect symbol of this transformation. For American crews, it represented redundant safety, backup systems, the luxury of multiple layers of protection. For Japanese pilots, it represented the minimum equipment necessary to briefly contest an altitude that American aircraft claimed as their natural environment. The mask symbolized the difference between fighting from a position of strength and fighting from desperation. As subsequent B-29 raids demonstrated American mastery of high-altitude warfare, the psychological impact spread throughout Japanese society. Citizens, watching silver specks of American bombers pass overhead beyond the reach of their defenders, understood viscerally that their military had lost control of the sky above their homeland. The traditional Japanese concept of territorial defense, protecting the sacred soil of the homeland, had been rendered meaningless by an enemy who struck from an altitude where the very air was too thin to sustain human life without artificial support. The November 24th raid established a pattern that would continue for the remainder of the war. American bombers would appear over Japan with increasing frequency, flying at altitudes where interception was nearly impossible, dropping their loads with the methodical precision of an industrial process, then returning to their bases with minimal losses. The raids became routine, predictable, unstoppable. The aerial equivalent of a factory assembly line producing destruction with mechanical efficiency. Japanese military commanders, studying intelligence reports of American B-29 production, realized the full scope of their predicament. The Americans were not merely building better aircraft, they were mass-producing technological superiority on an industrial scale. Boeing factories in Seattle were turning out superfortresses with the same systematic efficiency that had produced Liberty ships and Sherman tanks. Each B-29 represented not just an individual weapon but a node in an integrated Industrial network designed to sustain prolonged high-intensity warfare across unlimited distances. Final irony of the altitude war was that it transformed the Pacific Ocean from Japan's greatest defensive barrier into America's strategic highway. The same vast distances that had once protected Japan from attack now became mere waypoints for aircraft designed to operate efficiently across transcontinental ranges. The B-29's ability to fly 16-hour missions with fuel reserves created a new geography of warfare where no location on Earth was beyond the reach of American strategic power. As the silver contrails of departing B-29s faded against the evening sky on November 24, 1944, they left behind more than physical destruction. They had rewritten the fundamental rules of aerial warfare, demonstrating that superior technology could create tactical advantages so overwhelming that courage, skill, and determination became irrelevant. The thin air of the stratosphere had become America's ultimate weapon, invisible, inescapable, and absolutely decisive. In the months that followed, as American bombing raids intensified and Japanese resistance proved increasingly futile, the oxygen mask emerged as the perfect metaphor for industrial warfare's transformation of human conflict. The Americans breathed easily behind their redundant life support systems, protected by the surplus capacity that abundant resources made possible. The Japanese gasped for breath through improvised equipment, their very survival dependent on inadequate tools stretched beyond their design limits. The sky above Japan had become American territory, claimed not through conquest, but through engineering, held not by force of arms, but through technological superiority so overwhelming that resistance became merely symbolic. In that thin, cold air where human beings could not naturally survive, American industrial might had found its perfect expression. Power projected across unlimited distance, sustained by inexhaustible resources, unopposed by any defense that desperate courage could devise. The B-29 raids over Japan proved that in industrial warfare, altitude was not merely a tactical advantage, it was a complete transformation of the strategic environment. The Americans had not simply built better aircraft, they had redefined the very nature of aerial combat, creating conditions where their enemies could not effectively fight back. In the democracy of thin air, only those with the industrial capacity to mass-produce technological solutions could claim citizenship. And in that rarefied atmosphere, 30,000 feet above the sacred soil of Japan, American abundance had found its most devastating expression, not in the weight of bombs dropped, but in the casual ease with which those bombs were delivered by men breathing comfortably through oxygen masks that symbolized a nation's infinite capacity to engineer victory from the very air itself.